see the room packed with people interested in learning more about this. I'm always surprised by how many people come to the talks on wild animal suffering. So I wanted to start by saying this isn't an introductory talk. It does presume a basic understanding of the problem of wild animal suffering. If you're interested in an introduction to the problem and what our project does, I can recommend a talk I gave last year at EA Global London, and it should be on YouTube, on the EA Global YouTube channel. So what I want to do with this talk is basically discuss the sorts of questions we need to be asking to understand whether and on what basis we want to prioritise wild animal suffering. I will then take a deeper look at two crucial considerations and sort of draw out the implications they have for the cause area. Okay, so a crucial consideration is a term coined by Nick Bostrom, and it's essentially an idea or argument that might plausibly reveal the need not just for some minor course adjustment, but for a major change in the direction of our endeavours or of our priorities. So we can break this down into three different components. We might say that as EAs, our primary goal is to help others as effectively as possible, and that the way we evaluate that is by improving the quality of life or reducing the suffering of moral patients. And so the simple case we might want to make for wild animal suffering is that suffering experiences in the wild are intense and frequent. The majority of animals are short-lived, and they experience prolonged forms of chronic suffering like disease, parasitism, starvation, or untreated injury. So if reducing the suffering experiences in the wild means that we might be improving the quality of life of a large percentage of moral patients, then if we can find cost-effective solutions, this is a problem that we should be focusing on. An example of a crucial consideration here might be, well, what if animals can't feel pain? In that case, the interventions that we try and implement don't really add any value to the lives of wild animals, and so we're not really doing any good. And just as a point, I actually think there's very good evidence that many wild animals can feel pain. That was just for the purpose of illustration. Okay, so here in this simple case, the evaluation standard is improving the quality of life or reducing the suffering of moral patients. What constitutes a moral patient, though, depends on your worldview. And so to maintain consistent terminology, I'm going to use the same worldview categories that the Open Philanthropy Project uses. So a long-termist worldview is one that assigns very high value to the long-term future. Near-termist human-centric worldview assigns very high value to improving the lives of humans in a relatively short time frame and excludes animal welfare considerations. And then a near-termist animal-inclusive worldview functions on the same time frame as the near-termist human-centric, but also gives significant moral weight to animals. Okay, so clearly from a near-termist human-centric worldview, you wouldn't consider wild animals moral patients, and so you wouldn't prioritise them when you're thinking about what sort of areas you want to focus on. Also, probably quite clearly from a near-termist animal-inclusive worldview, you would consider that at least some wild animals are moral patients, and so whether or not you prioritise this over perhaps, say, factory farming or another cause that focuses on humans and animals depends a lot on how cost-effective wild animal suffering is relative to other causes. And then the last one is the long-termist worldview. So usually this tends to focus on the enormous number of people who will live in the long-term future. And the case is that because the number of people who could live over the next millions or billions of years is so large that it dwarfs all near-term considerations. And so what we should be doing is focusing our altruistic efforts on setting the scene so that humanity can flourish and so we can achieve our full potential. I think in general, this view tends to focus a lot on the benefit that humans gain, but it's silent on whether it gives moral weight to non-human moral patients. And it's not clear to me whether it implicitly does so. And since it could be a catastrophic oversight on our part if we don't consider non-humans who might exist in the long-term future, what I would say is that we might prefer to create this sort of subcategory of a long-termist, non-human inclusive worldview. And this one functions on the same timeline as a long-termist view, but also takes into account populations of non-humans. And that might mean populations of animals, biological non-humans, but also potentially artificial non-humans as well, if we think there's a good case for them to be considered moral patients. Okay, so what I'll do now is look at the near-termist animal-inclusive worldview and try and think about crucial considerations for this worldview and then also for the long-termist non-human inclusive worldview. Okay, so let's start with near-termist animal-inclusive. So first we want to start with, well, what's the case for prioritising wild animal suffering? Arguably, it rests on the scale of the problem. And there are a couple of different ways that we can think about the scale of wild animal suffering. First, we can look at abundance. So here we might be looking at using farmed animals as our baseline. So the number of farmed vertebrates in the world is approximately 123 billion. The number of wild vertebrates in the world is approximately 1 quadrillion, and the number of invertebrates is 1 sextillion. So this chart is on a log scale. So every whole unit is the equivalent of an order of magnitude greater than the one before. The next way we might look at it is through biomass. So for biomass, we can see that farmed vertebrates, excluding fish, amount to 0.1 gigatons of carbon. Wild vertebrates amount to 0.709 gigatons of carbon, and invertebrates are 1.72 gigatons of carbon. The third approach we might take is then to look at neuron count. And again, we see using farmed animals as our baseline, farmed chickens and cows amount to about 9 quintillion. Wild vertebrates are at 44 sextillion, and invertebrates are at 217 sextillion. One caveat that's important here is that when we look at the number of neurons, in wild vertebrates, they are dominated by fish. And unfortunately, our farmed vertebrate estimates don't include estimates of farmed fish. We just don't have that data on hand. And so the difference between the farmed chickens and cow figure and wild vertebrates would in reality be much smaller than it currently looks here. Okay, so if we're looking at these figures alone and using them to guide our prioritization, what we might say then is that invertebrates tend to dominate the scale at every measure. And so that means that we would use, and because invertebrates tend to dominate the scale, they increase the number of wild animals that are subject to this problem. And so that's sort of the reason why we might prefer to focus on this as opposed to, or the reason why we might think this is a high priority problem. But there are a couple of caveats that we need to make before we move forward. First, the abundance comparison, so this one over here, assumes that farmed vertebrate lives are equal to wild vertebrate lives. I think that's a pretty safe assumption in the sense that you would expect that you would value the life of a pig the same as you would value the life of a wild boar. But there are some other, I guess, assumptions that I think might be subject to stronger criticism or might perhaps be inaccurate. So the first is that this way of looking, or this way of, I guess, assessing the scale doesn't really take into account a comparison of the disutility in farming and in the wild. So it might be the case that farmed animals have much worse experience, much more intense experiences than animals in the wild, or vice versa. We haven't really done that assessment, although people have certain intuitions about which is and isn't worse. Another criticism we can make is that abundance measures equate vertebrate lives with invertebrate lives, which is likely to be inaccurate. So it doesn't really seem to be the case that we could value a fly in the same way that we might value a cow. And I'm going to look at how we can work through the way we value invertebrate lives a little bit later in the talk. Okay, so what are some crucial considerations for the near term? So because our, assessment of scale is quite simplistic, what we might want to do is ask, well, what sort of considerations could radically change the way, or the way we determine the expected value of our efforts? And we can break this down both into the number of moral patients affected and the severity of their experiences. So we might ask, well, firstly, are invertebrates even moral patients? Do we think that we should be considering insects when we talk about suffering experiences? Are fetuses moral patients or larvae? And then how do we decide on the moral weight of different kinds of moral patients? So this goes back to how do we weigh different animals, or how do we weigh different taxonomies? On the severity, we might be asking, well, how bad are various ways of dying? How prevalent are certain experiences, particularly chronic experiences? And what are the degrees in the capacity to feel pain? Or are there even degrees in capacity to feel pain? So now, this talk isn't going to try and answer these questions, mostly because there aren't clear answers to these questions. So what I'm going to do is take the first one, the question, are invertebrates moral patients, and look at what it implies based on different responses. So if the answer is no, then what we end up seeing is that the scale of the problem drops quite significantly. Again, the scale is still larger than, for example, our baseline, which is farmed animals, but it's significantly smaller. The ratio is significantly smaller, and when we pair that with the fact that it's much harder to make progress on a problem like wild animal suffering, it might be the case that we end up favouring working on other causes, or we end up lowering the priority that we would give to wild animal suffering. However, I think it's really unlikely that we can just say invertebrates are not moral patients. And there's two reasons I think this is the case. The first is that we don't really have a clearly defined measure of moral patienthood. So when we think about moral patienthood, what we tend to do is start with this baseline of humans, so we consider ourselves moral patients. And we think about the sort of features that are relevant, or that we think are relevant to our moral patienthood, and then we extrapolate those to the sorts of features that animals might have. So we're interested in like demonstrations of nociception, so we demonstrate pain avoidance and pleasure-seeking behaviour, and so we might think, well, do animals do the same thing? If they do, is it deliberate or is it a mechanical sort of behaviour? We might be thinking about cognitive complexity, or like the ability to use tools, or we might be thinking about some sort of subjective experience like self-recognition. These are the sorts of things that we look for, but none of them are perfect in and of themselves. And the second reason that we might not really be able to say for sure that invertebrates are not moral patients is that experts disagree on the extent to which invertebrates demonstrate these behaviours. And so, for example, some studies will show some invertebrates demonstrating pain avoidance behaviour, and other studies will show the same invertebrates or different invertebrates not demonstrating that behaviour. So because we have so much uncertainty, what can we do about it right now? The first approach we could try and take is the precautionary principle. So what we could do is say, well, we're going to act in a way that presumes invertebrates are moral patients, and take their interest into account in our policies. I think that kind of makes sense in cases where where we might be causing unnecessary suffering. So for example, we might want to stop wearing silk, because silk involves in the process of creating silk, we have to boil silkworms alive. Or we might not favour replacing existing animal farms with insect farms. We might favour instead just promoting clean meat, or investing resources in trying to bring clean meat to cost competitiveness. However, I don't think the precautionary principle is in and of itself going to be a very satisfactory response, or a very satisfactory approach. And that's because it's silent on how we weigh invertebrates relative to other animals, so it doesn't really help us figure out to what extent we should be investing resources in this particular problem versus the experiences of suffering in the wild that other animals might have. It's silent on how we weigh different classes of invertebrates. So when we talk about invertebrates, we're actually talking about an enormous range of different animals, and the experiences or complexity of a fly is very different to that of a nematode. And the last reason why it's not very satisfactory is because it might not be cost effective. We might just be spending resources on a problem that doesn't actually exist. So the next approach we might want to take is to think about expected value. I mean, this is something that EAs do quite a lot of, so this will probably be quite familiar to many of you. So we might go, well, we give P probability of invertebrates being moral patients, and then P times the number of invertebrates, if P times the number of invertebrates is equal to or larger than the number of known moral patients, and if invertebrates are moral patients, then they matter equally per individual as vertebrates, then that means that when we think about invertebrates alone, wild suffering dominates currently all other known cause areas from a near-termist animal-inclusive perspective. However, this also has some problems in the approach. The first one, there are two questions we might want to ask. The first is, well, how do we tell what the probability P is of invertebrates being moral patients? And the second is, if invertebrates don't matter per individual as vertebrates, how much do they matter? And so there are a few different measures we might want to use to try and assess this. And these are the sorts of measures that experts use to try and understand how we determine the probability that some animals are moral patients, and then also how we weigh the probability, or how we weigh the relevance or the moral weight we give to different animals. So we might start by saying, well, there's a positive correlation between brain size and intelligence, so the larger the brain, the more intelligent you'll be. But what you end up seeing in the first category is that an elephant has approximately 4 times the brain size of a human, and we don't tend to think of elephants as more intelligent than humans. So you do a bit more investigation and you realize, well, perhaps absolute brain size alone isn't sufficient. You need to look at brain size relative to body size, because the brain, the bigger a body, the more energy the brain spends on just core bodily functions. And so here we get a much more intuitive result where the ratio of a human brain to body size is much smaller than that of an elephant. Another approach we might want to take is to look at the number, rather than to look at the weight of a brain, we might think, well, what about the number of neurons? Because the reason brain size is correlated with intelligence is because of the neurons and the functions that they perform. And so, again, we get this very counterintuitive response where an elephant has more neurons than a human, and it doesn't really seem obvious to us how we can break that down further. And so we might instead, again, rather than looking at the absolute number, think of it relative to where the neurons are located in the brain. And so we know that the center of cognitive complexity and advanced intelligence is in the cerebral cortex, or in the neocortex more specifically. And so we might want to think, well, how many neurons are located in this part of the brain as opposed to the cerebellum? And these are approaches that we can use to help us better understand which animals maybe satisfy the sorts of proxies that we tend to link to moral patienthood, but they're not really sufficient in and of themselves. Okay, so that was like a snapshot of the near-termist animal-inclusive worldview. Now let's look at the long-termist non-human inclusive worldview. So here it's much more difficult to try and assess scale of a problem. What we might do, so I guess the only organisation that I know of that's tried to do this quantitatively is 80,000 Hours. And so I've taken the first two figures from there. So in their problem framework for positively shaping AI, they suggest that the scale of the problem is approximately 15 out of 16. And again, these figures are on a log scale, so 1 unit is an order of magnitude greater than before. And so basically trying to solve the problem of positively shaping AI will increase the expected value of the future by, I can't remember, I think it's 1 to 10%. For farm animal welfare, they estimate that the effect that it has is on the expected, on increasing the expected value of the human future. So, for example, if we can solve between 10 to 90% of the problem of factory farming now, then that promotes more humane attitudes, and that increases the expected value of the future by between 0.1 and 1%. And that's a score of between 12 and 14, so it sits at 13. I think the same sort of reasoning might apply when you talk about working on reducing wild animal suffering now. So efforts to reduce wild animal suffering now, if successful, would promote more humane attitudes towards non-humans. promote just more humane attitudes amongst humans themselves, and that might increase the expected value of the future. I've given it a slightly lower ranking than farm animal welfare, because to me, if it's contingent on the amount of the problem we can solve, I'm perhaps less confident that we can solve between 10 to 90% of the problem, and so we might want to give it sort of a slightly lower ranking in terms of the scale of the problem that it solves. Okay, so crucial considerations for the long term. What do they look like? So we might want to be thinking about, is there more disvalue than value in nature? Do we expect future populations to care about non-humans without our efforts? And do we expect future populations to spread wild animal suffering? Or do we expect future populations to... could advancements in artificial intelligence mean that we create sort of digital moral patients that resemble biological wild animals and that we think might potentially be good candidates for moral patienthood? What population ethics do we subscribe to is a very important question. And the last one, how durable are value systems? So how likely is it that the moral views that we promote today will last in the long run? Or how likely is it that post-humans who have achieved a much greater level of intelligence will converge on a moral system that incorporates non-humans? So as with the near-termists, I'm going to just pick the first one and look a little bit more at why it matters and what the implications of the problem are. So is there more disvalue than value in nature? What we want to understand here is whether the aggregate amount of suffering in nature outweighs that of happiness. And so as with our first problem, the evidence here is really scant. I think the question matters because if we think there's more disvalue than value in nature, then it has implications for what we do in the long term. It might mean that we are morally prevented from spreading nature beyond Earth. It might mean that we don't want to terraform through space colonization. It might mean that we're obliged to prevent artificial simulations from being created, presuming that we can't flip the sign or that our actions are irreversible. Trying to answer this question is very complicated, and so something we might want to do is sort of break it down into much smaller questions. And these questions end up being standalone crucial considerations in and of themselves, and they're ones that we've already encountered. So again, which humans are non-moral patients? How do we decide on the weights of different kinds of moral patients? How bad are negative experiences, and conversely, how good are some positive experiences? In his initial talk, Nick Bostrom, when he introduces crucial considerations, he addresses a similar concern by using tentative signposts. And so the idea here is that we want to define what sort of concrete outcomes we want more or less of, since we can't really answer the question in and of itself right now. And so we can do something similar here. We might say, well, since we're really uncertain about the net sign of the actions that we might take, we want to avoid doing anything that's irreversible. We want to avoid potentially increasing suffering by taking an action now that we think might be positive but that we later discover isn't actually. And so instead what we might want to do is focus more on better understanding the problem, on better understanding our values, and on better understanding why we think what we think is important. Another approach we could take is to look at the moral value of information. And so this is an idea that Amanda Askell first brought up in a talk she gave, I think in 2017, also at EAGxAustralia. And so the idea here is that there's an extremely high moral value of information where credences in our beliefs have low resilience. So what we might say is that our belief in the net value or disvalue of nature is based on whatever set of evidence is available to us. The set of evidence that's available to us is really poor, so our resilience in that belief is really low. And that means that the expected value of any intervention that we take is not going to be robust. So instead, what we might want to do is invest in interventions that have high informational value. And that is, of course, contingent on whether or not being able to acquire that information is at a relatively low cost, and that depends on whether we can sort of answer some of these questions easily. Comfortingly, even though this approach is quite different to the tentative signposts, it leads us to the same conclusions, which is that we want to focus on better understanding the problem, we want to focus on better understanding our values, and on understanding what matters to us. So to conclude, I'm not really going to be able to give you any answers in this talk. It's not really one of those talks. But what I can do is, if you found this talk interesting, I encourage you to learn much more about the problem. These are some texts that I found really useful. I would also say feel free to come up and talk to me at any time throughout this conference. I'll be around for the rest of this afternoon and tomorrow. And I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was informative.
Excellent. Thank you, Persis. Just quickly, I will offer one question. We have had a few come through, and then we will quickly move on. We've got a question here. Someone has asked, a common critique that they hear of wild animal suffering as a cause is that it doesn't seem very tractable to work on. This could just be a time issue, but in any case, what current interventions or actions may be considered tractable at the moment within the movement?
Yeah, so I think when you want to think about interventions, you want to break them down into sort of broad and narrow. These are very simplistic. It's a very simplistic distinction, but your broad interventions might be just how can we better understand the problem space, and how can we take sort of very generic actions that mean we, in the long run, will end up doing the right thing. Or in the long run, when something more, when a narrow intervention becomes available, we can end up taking action on it. So a broad intervention might be doing more research, which tends to be what we do, which is what we tend to focus on at our project. It might also be promoting anti-speciesist views, or promoting more humane attitudes toward wild animals. In terms of narrow interventions, I wouldn't really recommend doing anything like intervening in nature right now, but there are lots of ways in which we already interfere with the lives of wild animals, and there are ways in which we can amend what we currently do so that it is more humane. For example, when we engage in population control activities, we might want to stop hunting, stop using baits and fumigation because they tend to inflict a lot of suffering, and instead run contraception or sterilization programs.
Excellent. Thank you, Persis.